So I'm Pete Dillon, and I'm a member of the Coastal Georgia Genealogical Society. And this presentation focuses on finding and using free online maps for genealogical research. And I'll be using my local area as an example. Maybe it's like a case study, but of course you can use these techniques to research and find maps for your own local area or wherever you're doing research for. So the first thing you might wonder is, why maps? Why use maps? And the reason is that place names change, boundaries change, towns disappear, become ghost cities, cemeteries disappear, addresses can change, like streets can be renumbered or streets can be renamed. You can also find residences and workplaces that might be of interest, and also spelling changes. So just as a little story, I had a branch of my family come from Virginia, the Virginia colony, and they moved to the western side of the colony. And then after independence, the state of Kentucky was formed. So now they were not living in Virginia, they were living in Kentucky. And then as people moved in, the counties were divided up to be more administratively compact, and now they were in a different county. And then the street was widened and had a different name. And as more people moved in, the street numbers for the houses changed. So if you just looked at the census or at tax records, it looked like they moved around a lot, but in fact, they were still in the same house the entire time. And that family actually still owns property in Kentucky in that same area. The first resource I'm going to look at is the Library of Congress. And this has the largest collection of maps probably in the world, but unfortunately only a small fraction of those have been digitized, but they're still very valuable. So if you go to loc.gov, and the page that comes up, if you click on the map button, that will bring you to their collection of maps. So they have the overall collection, and then that collection is divided into sub-collections. So what I did here is put in Glynn County, and this is an example of the results that came up. So the first map here is really a navigational map. It dates from 1780. So I was not too interested in that. The other maps are these Sanborn Fire insurance maps. And they made these maps for insurance companies, and they're quite detailed. And I find them very interesting. They're really fascinating. So let's zoom in on one. This is the Brunswick map from 1893. And in this map, there's an index that lists different streets, and you can see the streets and the commercial areas. So the areas here that are different colors, these were the commercial buildings in the commercial area. And really that's what the insurance companies were interested in. So you might think back to this time period, the 1880s, 1890s, and there were quite a number of fires. You might think of the Chicago fire, the San Francisco fire. So these were very important maps for both commercial people and for the insurance companies. If we get a little closer look, this is the commercial area of Brunswick, part of it. And you can see that they identified what the businesses were in each building. This red color means that these were brick buildings. And if you looked at this grocery store, you see this number 2, that was a 2-story building. So maybe you had an ancestor who had this address as their home. Well, you'd see that they were above the grocery. So maybe that meant that they were grocers and they worked in that grocery. You can also see some demographic material here. So there's a Chinese laundry that tells you a little bit about the people that lived in this area. And then down here, which is really interesting to me, they have the name of the livery, Putnam's livery. So if you were descended from the Putnam family, you might find this interesting. Another correlation you can do, so this is the 1890s, and there was photography back then. You might find pictures of old stores, old buildings, maybe old residences, and you might be able to correlate those to these different businesses here. So if you're building a story like a family history story, that might be interesting to you as well. Now, I live on Jekyll Island, which is part of Glynn County, and I wanted to see what they had here. This is the Jekyll Island Club. And one thing about the Jekyll Island Club, it was created in the late 1880s by millionaires. So a lot of very famous rich people, such as the Rockefellers, J.P. Morgan, Pulitzer, they all wintered here. Some of them stayed in the hotel, and this red building, red and yellow building here is the hotel. And then some were allowed to build their own cottages. So they called these cottages, I call these mansions. A lot of these buildings are 6-7 bedroom houses. If we look a little closer, we'll find that this one belonged to Mr. Fairbank. And he was a manufacturer, a Chicago manufacturer. His name was Nathan Kellogg Fairbank, and he built this cottage in 1889. It had 6 bedrooms, 2 baths, a great hall, a library, and a kitchen. Unfortunately, it was torn down in 1944, but the footprint still exists on the island. If you were descended from Mr. Fairbank, it would be interesting to come to Jekyll Island. You can see exactly the outline of this house that they have identified on the island. Another interesting source is the U.S. Geologic Survey. And these maps are very detailed. They go back to about 1880 that have been digitized. So when you bring this page up, go to this website, bring this page up, you can put the location in here. And I put in Glynn County. I brought up quite a number of maps. So I picked this one, which is about 10 miles from my house. And this is a map from 1839. So all these little squares, you see these little squares here, are structures, and most of them are houses or barns. And if you were looking for maybe where one of your ancestors had lived, you could theoretically pinpoint exactly where they were. The dotted lines here are dirt roads. In 1939, this area was rather poor, and most of the roads were not paved. You'll notice that there's almost no bridges too, so they used ferries to get across the rivers. Colonel's Island today is one of the East Coast's largest roll-on, roll-off car import ports. So it's completely different than what it looks like here. It's almost all paved with parking lots. Also, I-95 goes through here, so the infrastructure and the housing in the current area is entirely different than the way this map looks. So I enjoyed going back and looking and seeing how this was. Down in the corner, there's a little island called Jointer Island. And on that island, there's it shows on this map that there's a house there. So I've paddled out there in my kayak, and you can actually see the foundations of that house. But the house itself is gone. So that's one of the issues you have when you're trying to find old residences, perhaps trying to look them up maybe in Google Earth, and you pull up the address and there's nothing there. Well, there might have been a house there back in the 1940s, but maybe it's not there today. This is another map from the U.S. Geologic Survey on Jekyll Island where I live. And I shared this with my neighbors, and it brought up a lot of questions. So first of all, there is no longer an Oglethorpe Road. There's actually 2 roads here. One is Riverside Drive and the other is Beachview Drive. And on the southern part of the island, there's now a housing development, and the 4-H has a camp here. But what had everybody really curious is this cemetery that's identified, because nobody knows of a cemetery there today. So we're wondering, well, was the cemetery maybe paved over by these houses, or has it disappeared into a little forest area here? It's all very curious. And this is a very historic area. Today it's St. Andrew's picnic area. And there's a monument there to the illegal slave ship, the Wanderer. So if you're familiar with the Wanderer in 1857, illegally brought slaves and it docked here. And this is the spot where they were brought. Another series of maps that I think are really interesting are these enumeration district maps. And these are very detailed. So what these maps were for census takers. They would draw a series of maps where the census taker was supposed to work and meet all the different families there. And the reason these maps were important is so that census takers did not cover the same area. So it'd be very annoying to people if a census taker came and you gave them information, and then the next day a different census taker came and gave you information. So I find these maps very useful. Steve Morse has put in a lot of details and a lot of tools to make searching these maps easier. You could go right to the National Archives and look, but then you'd be looking through a lot of material on your own, kind of browsing through. So on his maps, you could put in the state, put in the county, and then if there was an urban area you were looking for, you would put that here. You would click on ED Maps, and then that would bring up a map like this. So this is Brunswick. It's the county seat of Glynn County. And this is the 1950 Census Enumeration District. And you can see the areas that were broken up for the census takers to work. If you get in more closely, so I've zoomed in, this will show you the streets where the different housing plots were. So this is not necessarily, there's not necessarily a house on every one of these little blocks, but there could be. And it also shows the name of the streets in 1950. So I happen to know that at least one of these streets has changed its name since then. And it also shows where cemeteries were and how the streets were laid out. Some of this is a little bit different today, but it's still very useful if you're doing work from 1950. So as a little story, I was trying to find out where my great aunt and my great grandmother lived in 1950. And I had looked in a city directory and I got the address and I plugged it in to Steve Morse's site, but I came up empty. So I thought, well, that's very curious. I'll just pull up the map for that area. And I was looking around for the street and I just could not find that street anywhere. It was called Sunny Terrace and was like a little cul-de-sac. Well, when the map makers were doing this for the census takers, they left that street off. And the census takers took their jobs very seriously and they only went to the places that were enumerated here. So they skipped Sunny Terrace because it was not on the map. So my great aunt was not counted in the census. And I confirmed that later when everything had been digitized and went to Ancestry and looked them up and they're not in the census. But otherwise, generally speaking, you should find everything you need on these maps. Local governments also have their own series of maps. So Glynn County is no different. And what these maps contain are a variety of different pieces of information. So the property maps are for houses in the county. People might think that this information would be private, but actually it's not. So the information for my house, I had looked my house up and it gave a satellite picture of my house and the appraised value and who the owners were back to 1985. So this might be different in your county or your state or wherever you are. Maybe the information goes back further than 1985. But I didn't want to put my house on here. So instead, I looked up the Jekyll Island Club Hotel. So if you might remember back to a previous map, a Sanborn map that we looked at, it showed the clubhouse in 1893. Well, this is the clubhouse today, and you can see it's much bigger than it was back then. And what all of these blue markers are areas that the clubhouse also manages. So what you're seeing here is not just the clubhouse, But this is Crane Cottage of the Crane plumbing magnate who built the cottage here. Cherokee Cottage, which was built for one of the doctors who had treated General Grant. And then down here is the Rockefeller House. So you can see the areas, how these houses were related to each other and to everyone around here, which might be useful information if you're looking up one of your ancestors who had lived in this area. The Glenn County also has maps that show historical information. So here, these brown rectangles are actually historical markers that were put up by the state. Now, if you came here and let's say you were descended from an enslaved person who worked at the Hamilton plantation, this would be useful because it shows where different slave cabins were located as well as cemeteries. So there's just loads of information here. If you drove around, you could find these different historical markers and then see what was there and how that related to your ancestors, perhaps. Maybe the Battle of Bloody Marsh, maybe you had an ancestor who fought with the British against the Spanish there at that. Or maybe you had a merchant marine who was on one of these ships that were sunk by German U-boats off the coast during World War II. This is a similar map. So what's interesting about this map is you see there's a red cross here, and these are black crosses here. The red cross means that this is on private property. This cemetery is on private property. If you were going to come here and do some research, you would have to coordinate with the owners of that property to go see that cemetery. Whereas if you went to, let's say, the Palmetto Cemetery, well, that's open to the public and you'd be able to go there and do research there. Another interesting site is called Old Maps Online. And I went to this site and put in our county to see what would come up. And a lot of information came up there. Some of it was duplicated with other sites like the US Geologic Survey. And then some of the maps were unique. What I found most useful about this site is I could bring up maps of Georgia, which showed the counties over periods of time. So here's a map. I believe this is from 1859. And what's interesting about this map is the way that certain places were spelled. So Jekyll Island here is spelled a different way, which might give me a clue as another search term to go for. And then it also has some different name changes. So there's an island here called Long Island, which today is called Sea Island. So there was a name change. If you were looking back, let's say in the 1840, 1850 census, and you had an ancestor living on Long Island, and you said, well, where is Long Island in Georgia? I don't see it. Well, that's because the name has changed. David Rumsey has a fantastic site. And this is one of those sites where you could just browse through all the maps because there's so much information here. And I've even found maps that he has digitized that were not digitized by the Library of Congress. So I highly recommend taking a look at his maps. Now, if we look at this map from 1818, you can see Jekyll Island, of course, is spelled a little bit differently. Today it's spelled J-E-K-Y-L-L. So that there's a possible search term that you could look for here. Blythe Island is also spelled differently. And this is St. Simon's Island. What's on this map are the identifications and the locations of plantations. So you see the Hamilton plantation here, the Cooper plantation, and then other locations that had important people, like Mr. Bender Esquire here. Another interesting thing about this map is from 1818. After Alexander Hamilton was shot by Aaron Burr Aaron Burr sought refuge on this island, and he stayed at this Cooper plantation. So people who would be researching perhaps your ancestors, maybe the Burr ancestors or the Hamilton ancestors, this would be an important part of the family history that you'd want to put together for that. This also has Long Island here. This is where Sea Island is today. And then I found Wikipedia to be an interesting source of information. So if you're not familiar with Wikipedia, it's a self-correcting and self-editing encyclopedia online. So people can edit and correct information that they think is not correct in here. And there's a whole process for doing that. So you don't have to, if you don't want to get involved in that, you don't have to. But they do have maps in here. One of the maps that I've looked at was this one for Brunswick. So this map was originally drawn up by the colonial government in the colony of Georgia. And some of the streets have the same names today. So here you see Bay Street, and today that's still called Bay Street. And they also adopted these squares. So if you're familiar with Savannah, Savannah is famous for its squares. And that was also the same procedure that they used here for Brunswick. The center street still exists today. Back then they called it George Street, obviously because King George was the monarch and this was a colonial possession. Today that's called Gloucester Street. So they changed that name, but a lot of the other names they haven't changed. And I found it interesting that Union Street was called Union Street even back in 1771. I thought maybe that had some connection with Union and Confederate when the Union soldiers had taken over the city, but no, it went back that far. The Turtle River here, this is interesting because this actually is called Oglethorpe Bay now, and the Turtle River is a little further away. But otherwise, this is very, very much the same city, except that it's grown quite a bit since this was made. And I'm pretty curious about how the city grew and what information could be found here. So if we look at the different internet sites, the summaries that I've looked at, these are not the only sites where you'll find information. You can look at local historical societies. They also have some map collections. Ours doesn't have that online, but where I grew up in upstate New York, they actually have some maps online. And one of the maps that they had identified the people that lived in particular houses on my street. So I found that very useful in doing research on different houses. So that map dated from about the 1850s. You can also find information from state archives and also from other county information. So just to go over this a little bit more, Library of Congress, it's easy to use and search, and they have a lot of subcategories. The U.S. Geologic Survey with very detailed maps that even identify particular houses where particular houses are located. The enumeration districts from Steve Morrison, they're also available on the National Archives, local county governments, and old maps online. And then David Rumsey's historical map collection, which has maps not just from the United States, but also from around the world, and then Wikipedia. So if there's any questions, please feel free to ask me now, and I'll be able to address those or talk to those.
Pete, there was one question from Roxanne asking which map had the historical markers, and do most or all states have those kinds of maps?
I can go back to that map. So this was in the county, our local county. Every state has historical markers. These historical markers on this map, I'm assuming that most counties would have something similar, or certainly most states or historical societies would have something similar to this. I chose these particular ones because it's a local area to me. And you can see all different kinds of information on these historical markers. Some of them relate to the way roads were set up. Here's a historical fort, battles. This area was a plantation area, so you can see plantations and also where different slave cabins are located. Some of these have been restored in St. Simon's, so this will be useful here. And I don't think there's any central repository for historical markers across the United States. I think it's a state-specific enterprise.
I know the state historical societies are their websites are good places to find things like that. Jesse said, I've been using maps for years and you've given me new sources. So that's
good.
great. And Jill wanted to know if you found that cemetery. I think she's mentioning the one in the south of Jekyll Island.
So no. So what I've heard about that is I talked to a local historian, and he said back in 1950, there was a house there, and he believes it either belonged to a fisherman or to maybe a guard. Maybe there was a guard house there when the millionaires owned the island, and it was torn down in 1950. I'm doubtful that somebody was buried in that location though. But so far, nobody has had any information. So another thing about living on an island like Jekyll Island, there's a lot of marshes. And it could be that if there was a cemetery there, it might have been washed away. There was a gentleman who lived on the island back in the early 1800s, about 1805 or so, Christophe de Binion. And during the Revolutionary War, he was a Frenchman, a French privateer actually, and a pirate. And then when the French Revolution came along, he became a target and he escaped to Jekyll Island. I understand that he was buried near his house, and the house still exists, and that his grave was eventually washed away to sea. So that's a danger that you can find. The mapping of the island itself back in the 1800s, the early 1800s, was not as specific as it was later. So it could be that he was buried near the marsh, and then the marsh was expanded and that grave disappeared. However, there is a cemetery right near where the house is for later Dominions, and also employees of the Jekyll Island Club have been buried there.
I have a question about the Sanborn maps. How far back do they go? And do they cover the rural areas?
Yes, so they go back into the 1880s, and they do cover rural areas. I found one. So last week I was helping a person who lives in a rural area try to find a particular house, and I wasn't actually able to find it using the Sanborn map, but I went to the enumeration district maps, and I went to the county map for where I grew up, and that actually had the house on the enumeration map. You can see on these maps, I went to Jekyll Island because I was curious if the Sanborn map would have had any other information besides what's here, and it did not. So I think it depends really on the rural area and and what specifically is there. If they were grain elevators maybe, or a lot of barns or farming, maybe like Borden's, for example, the Borden's Dairy Farm, you'll probably find that, but you won't find smaller houses, I don't think, because they were not as interested in residential areas as they were in commercial areas.
Jill also asked if there are current day Sanborn maps.
No, no, I believe they stopped around the 1930s.
And I put a link in the chat for anybody interested in our local area, cemeteries in particular. Amy Hedrick, a local genealogist, has a wonderful site called glengen.com, and she has mapped a lot of really obscure and smaller cemeteries there.
So I think these maps are useful if you're doing family histories and you're writing books perhaps, or making something for your family to share with your family, because you could stick these maps in there. They're all free, free public maps. They ask you not to, some of the sites ask you not to reproduce them like the old map site and sell them, because that's what they do. So you'd be in competition with them, but they don't have any heartburn with you actually using these maps for research or for sharing with family members. The David Rumsey site has guidelines for using their maps, because they do sell those maps to make money for themselves.
Gloria commented that she's looking for land in South Carolina from about 1785. She has the purchase record, the book number and the page, but in the will, the land was passed on to a family member and she can't find this land in later records, so she's looking for transfers of ownership.
For that, I would look into South Carolina state records, maybe county records. One of the problems with doing research that far back in South Carolina is so much was destroyed during the Civil War. You might not be able to find the county records. You could look into the state records though, and see if there's any state records. I don't think you couldn't use the Sanborn maps. You could look back maybe into the Library of Congress and see what they had, especially if there were land grants. You might be able to find something there.
Oops. Cheryl pointed to the wonderful Cindy's list, of course, for ideas on maps. Did you use that, Pete, in looking for map sources?
Yeah, so I use Cindy's list quite a bit. I chose a subset of maps. I mean, there's so many map resources, really. I chose a subset of maps, since I didn't want the presentation to drone on, because I can go off on a tangent and cover more material than would fit in, let's say, a half hour, and still include time for questions. But Cindy's list is really fantastic for that. And then she has she's a member of that group called the Genealogy Club, I think it is, which I belong to. So that's very useful too.
Is that the Genealogy Squad?
Yeah, Genealogy Squad. Yeah, that's it.
I'll put a link to that too.
Mm-hmm.
Roxanne commented that she's so glad she attended today. She's going to New England next month for a road trip to explore battlefields and historical sites where her ancestors fought in the Revolutionary War.
Oh, well, good luck.
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
Do you have any experience with mapping technology where you kind of overlay maps and do plats?
I have some experience with GIS, the ESRI maps. Yeah, so I'm planning on doing some of my own mapping, but I haven't started that yet. But it's not related to genealogy, actually. It's related to running. I'm in a running club, so we were going to use that technology to map out courses. Are you thinking of something in particular?
When I attended the IGHR, there were several others who were talking about different software they used where they would get old colonial maps or things, and then they could overlay kind of GPS coordinates to find the places today.
Mhm.
And that was something completely new to me. So I didn't know if you had any experience with doing things like that.
I haven't had experience doing that, but I'll tell you this. On this map, I would like to do that because I would like to see how the current infrastructure overlays on this map to see how different it is. I have a lot of questions about this map in particular, especially with the way the marshes have seemingly shrunken. Because I drive past this area all the time and it doesn't seem like the marshes are as vast as they are on this map. I don't know if they've been filled in or I just don't know what's happened with that.
I'd love to hear feedback if you ever start to play with that.
Yeah, so that's one of my genealogy goals is to start overlaying maps and trying to figure out how things have changed and where houses have disappeared and just information like that, which I think would be very useful for people who are doing research in this area.
Thank you.
Lillian, I think you already know this, but for anybody who joined after the beginning, our next program is on September 18th, and it's specifically on the subject of finding your ancestors, telling your family story with Google Earth. And she's going to talk about how to, do the pins and things. And I will send her a note and ask her if she can address the issue of any other software that's out there for doing that kind of thing.
Thank you.
So I've also used Google Maps, put in addresses to see where houses are that my ancestors have lived in. I'm assuming other people have done that too. And then zoom down to the street level look to see what the houses have looked like. But I haven't really talked about that since that'll be in, I'm sure that will be in next month's discussion.
Cheryl just put a link to American Revolution Institute Revolutionary War maps for people who are interested in that. And someone asked about saving the chat log, and I believe you can save it now, but I'm going to send an email to everybody who registered for today's program to let them know when the recording is available, and I'll include the chat log with that. Any other questions? You can unmute or put them in the chat. Pete, this was really interesting. I really enjoyed it. I don't know why. I guess I'm geographically challenged, and maps have always been an issue for me. So it was really helpful to see you lay it out this way. I really appreciate your taking the time to do that for all of us.
You're welcome. I really enjoy looking at maps. When I was a youngster, my parents had an atlas, and I still have that atlas right now because I enjoy looking at it so much. And I've just always enjoyed looking at maps and trying to figure out where different places were. this kind of fit in with one of my interests in genealogy.
Perfect. That really helps the rest of us. Thank you so much. And if nobody has, we're getting a lot of kudos in the chat. And if nobody else has any questions, I think that's it for us today. Please do check out the website and sign up for next month's meeting if you're interested. And we will, oh, wait, there's a question. Are there any areas of the USA that do not have historical maps or where the old maps are hard to find?
Not that I'm aware of. I think mapping, well, certainly for the US Geologic Survey, all those every corner of the US has been mapped. Yeah, I'm not aware that any place does not have historical maps. Yeah, I think Americans like mapping.
Which is good for genealogists. I'm just looking for any more questions. I don't see any. So we'll give you back the rest of your Sunday afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for coming.